Hello, good morning and good afternoon. I'm Martin Quencez. I'm a research fellow and the deputy director of the German Marshall Fund in Paris. I'm very happy to welcome you all for this virtual event on France has voted, what is next for European security and transatlantic cooperation. So you may have seen that yesterday the French went to the booth and voted to re-elect President Macron with 58.5% of the votes. Marine Le Pen got about 31.5%. And in many ways, this election was truly a choice between two visions for the role of France in the world and in Europe. And this is with great pleasure that we'll have a chance in the next 60 minutes or so to discuss what may happen now in terms of French European and foreign policy. We'll look more specifically at the French-US bilateral relationship, and we'll take questions from all of you. You can use the Q&A function of the Zoom platform at the bottom of your screen. I'm very happy to be joined by three excellent speakers today. Sylvie Kauffmann, who is editorial director and columnist at Le Monde and also a regular contributor to the opinion pages of the New York Times, joining us today to discuss Macron's European vision, the future of the French European policy during this second mandate of the Macron presidency, and also to look at the future of the relationship with Russia, considering the Macron initiative for a rapprochement with Moscow in 2019, the current Russian invasion of Ukraine, and what the president may do to adapt his posture vis-à-vis Russia. I will then turn to Pierre Morcos, who is a visiting fellow at the Europe, Russia and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS in Washington, DC. Pierre is a career diplomat with the French Foreign Service and is served in different positions, among which deputy head for strategic affairs and cybersecurity here in Paris. We will discuss the future of the French-US relationship with Pierre, especially on strategic affairs, defense policy, and we will see what we can expect in terms of the cooperation between the Biden administration and the Macron II government. And last but certainly not least, I will turn to my colleague Edgar Tam. Edgar is a visiting senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Paris. He is a defense analyst and based in London now as a liaison for the DoD. He's also the author of a regular GMF publication, The Perspectives from Washington, in which he provides analysis on the current geopolitical issues and the way it is perceived from DC. So we will ask Edgar what he thinks the Biden administration may do to engage with Emmanuel Macron in the future now that the election is behind us, and perhaps more personally, what you think should be the priority of the French-US defense relationship, given the current geopolitical context. This is under Chatham House rule. You're very welcome to be frank and honest in your presentation. Maybe I will give you 6-7 minutes each to share your views in introductory remarks, after what we can take questions from those participants, and certainly a few questions from me, because I would love to have your views on a couple of things. But let me turn to Sylvie first for the big picture and especially the European and Russia policy. We're still muted, I think, Sylvie.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Martin. Good morning and good afternoon. The first thing I think is that we're going to have a peaceful, at least orderly end to the French rotating presidency of the EU with this re-election of Emmanuel Macron. Of course, it would have been totally different under a Le Pen presidency. And I think even in Paris, we could hear last night the sigh of relief from Brussels. Not only from Brussels, but I think in Brussels, it was quite a big one. And Emmanuel Macron made 2 phone calls last night, or took 2 phone calls last night after his victory. One was with Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and the second one was with President Volodymyr Zelensky. So that shows, I think, the two priorities for Emmanuel Macron's foreign policy at the dawn of this second term. Regarding Scholz, the strong Franco-German relationship remains a priority. It's a pillar for the European Union. And I think the threat that Marine Le Pen posed to this relationship, to this Franco-German tandem, in her program, she wanted to pull out of joint defense programs, Franco-German defense programs. And that, in a way, made everybody even more aware of how crucial this relationship is, not only for France and Germany, but for the EU as a whole. Of course, I'm not talking about the fiscal issues and European issues that will come up. That's another subject, but I think there are differences which will have to be addressed within this Franco-German relationship. Of course, differences on energy, and the war in Ukraine has put more emphasis on this, and also on defense, of course, and the Zeitenwende of Scholz that he presented on February 27, just after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, still has to be, translated into concrete proposals in many areas, including in defense, of course. And we'll have to see what happens to those joint defense programs, and notably the what you call it, SCAF, Future Combat Air System, maybe, yeah. There are a lot of question marks, which there were a lot of question marks before the war, but I think there are even more now. But I guess this is something we'll talk about in more details later. Strategic autonomy, strategic sovereignty, that was the mantra before the war and in the first term, of course, of Macron. I think it will stay the mantra, but how, because and Macron considers that the two big crises that we've been through, or that we're still going through for the war, so COVID-19 and the war, are in a way have been a vindication of his views on strategic autonomy. But again, we'll have to see how this evolves, of course, with the particularly in view of the evolving transatlantic relationship between the US and the whole of Europe, with this enormous commitment and weight of the United States in this war. Under the EU, the French presidency of the EU, of course, the sanctions are going to be another issue that will have to be looked at. There is a summit, an extraordinary summit on May 30, an EU summit, May 30 and May 31st, and the 27 heads of states and government will look at sanctions, or at the issue of, the very, very difficult issue of oil and gas embargo, which is a divisive issue. And of course, the further we go on with these sanctions in the European Union, the more fragile European unity is. So that's one thing. During this summit, we also, the 27 will also look at, how they can progress on the way to getting rid of the dependency to Russia on gas, whether they can have organized mutual purchase of gas, reform of electricity network, and so on. The European Commission is to publish, I think in late May, before that summit, May 23rd, probably, some proposals, its own proposal, on how to end European dependency to Russian gas. Probably the ambition which was stated in March, which was to get rid of this dependency before 2030, I think we'll have to, now this seems too far given the environment of the military pressure and so on. So maybe this will have to be put forward. On defense, probably this summit will also have to look at investment needs in terms of quality and quantity, in terms of coordination. And I think this is going to be a big issue also. How do investments in defense, in equipment, can be better coordinated among EU members? And France, of course, will have leading views on this. On June 11, there will be another summit on enlargement, and that's also a security issue because it's, of course, this discussion of enlargement of the EU used to be focused on Western Balkans, but now there's the whole question of Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia. And this is really a game changer for the question of enlargement. Again, there will be differences among the member states, and this will be a very important moment. The strategic compass was adopted within the European Union, so that's done. But there's the NATO, on the way to the NATO summit in June in Madrid. There will probably have some very important discussions on the relation, on the EU and NATO relationship. I mean, this war in Ukraine is really changing so much and reframing the discussion so much that I think this hasn't been an issue at all in the French presidential campaign. But it will, I think now we're going to have to look very seriously at it. Just a word on Russia now. And I think maybe if we have to talk about another important issue, which is Sahel, I'll keep it for later because I'm already too long. On Russia, this is an evolving, I think Macron's position is really a work in progress. He's stopped, his dialogue with Putin has stopped. Last time they spoke was on March 29. And since then, a couple of days later, there was the Bucha massacre. And since then, Macron hasn't spoken to Putin. He doesn't exclude talking to him again. But I think at the moment, the way it is presented, this would only happen if there is something concrete to talk about. Namely, the French are working a lot with other allies on the security, on the question of the security guarantees, which would have to be prepared with to guarantee the neutrality of Ukraine when the war ends. But obviously, we are not there yet. There's this full offensive going on in Donbass. So I think at the moment, the way it's been looked at, the so-called dialogue with, direct contacts with the Putin would only start again in the framework of those talks about security guarantees or a ceasefire or something of the sort. And so I don't think, all this talk before the war about, new European security architecture is mentioned much at the moment because, who knows how this war is going to evolve. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sylvie. And I'll certainly come back to a couple of things you said, both on Europe and Russia. But let me turn to Pierre to discuss the agenda on the bilateral Franco-American relationship.
Many thanks, Martin. Maybe let me start by reminding that this is not the end of the electoral cycle in France. We have to wait until the June election, the parliamentary elections, to know if President Macron will have a majority to fully implement his foreign policy and domestic agenda. Regarding the future of the US-French relationship, let me say three broad comments. First, I think it's important to have in mind that throughout his first mandate, Macron experienced quite a difficult relationship with Washington. First, with the Trump administration, he spent a lot of energy trying to convince Trump not to deconstruct international norms and rules from the JCPOA to the Paris Agreement with little success, as we know. And when President Biden was elected, there was hope in Paris that it would open a new chapter in the transatlantic relationship. We all know that AUKUS happened and clearly damaged this new momentum, eroded the trust between both capitals, and clearly signaled so that from a US perspective, the highest priority was not necessarily Europe anymore, but its so-called pivot toward the Indo-Pacific and Asia. Having said that, and that's my second comment, despite these turbulences, both countries managed to maintain a deep alliance and a strong cooperation, especially on security and defense, because they share the same values. They have aligned interests on many issues related to defense, and including under the Trump administration, it was striking to see how deep was the defense cooperation between Paris and Washington, notably in the fight against terrorism in Iraq, Syria, or in the Sahel. Quickly after AUKUS happened, both governments understood that they had to turn the page quite rapidly, and they agreed on quite an ambitious joint statement adopted in Rome last October, which launched many bilateral and European initiatives on the fight against terrorism, the Indo-Pacific, European security, energy, to name a few. So when it comes to the next months and years, and that's my third comment, what would be the main topics on the agenda? And I would like to mention three of them. The first, it goes without saying, is of course Russia, and it was mentioned by Sylvie already. Clearly, it's striking to see how strong was the cooperation between Washington and Paris on that crisis. They clearly worked in lockstep on sanctions, on the support to Ukraine. There is a clear alignment between both capitals in that crisis, and the most pressing matter would be to continue that immediate response to the crisis. First, through the support to Ukraine, and France has a few days ago decided to scale up its assistance to Kiev through the delivery of long-range artillery, but also through additional sanctions. And President Macron has said publicly that he would be in favor of EU sanctions against Russian oil, for instance. But beyond these immediate priorities, I think both capitals will also need to address the long-term consequences of that conflict for European security. First in NATO, because the alliance is thinking about the future of its military posture, and will adopt a seminal document, which is a new strategic concept at the Madrid summit in June. And this is clearly a pivotal moment for the alliance, as it will think about how to strengthen its military posture to deter potential Russian aggression. And clearly France and the US will have to work on it. And it goes also regarding the EU, where I think Paris will keep pushing for a stronger European defense, and will try to count on US support on that. And in the Rome Declaration I mentioned earlier, Washington, for quite the first time, explicitly supported a stronger and more capable European defense as a contribution to transatlantic security. So clearly Paris is expecting support from Washington. The second topic is China and the Pacific. even though Europe is perceived as a secondary actor in Washington, in that region. I think that Paris will keep pushing for a European role and engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and will call for a continued cooperation between Washington and Brussels in that region. And the third topic, and it was alluded to by Sylvie, is the fight against terrorism. Of course, it has been overshadowed by this return to power politics, but terrorist groups in Iraq and most importantly in the Sahel are quite resilient. The international action has been made quite complicated by the presence of the Wagner group. And I think that both Paris and Washington will have to work on it and not let their guard down regarding that threat. So these are the main issues, and we have, I think, 2 years which will be critical before the next US election in 2024. And we have this window of opportunity of a clearly sympathetic US administration toward Europe and transatlantic security. And we have to seize that moment. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Edgar, maybe views from DC and how perhaps you can complement what Pierre just said on the US-French agenda.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Martin. This is an interesting forum, obviously a good time for this. I think it is safe to say that US policymakers went to bed last night with sort of an air of relief, if you will, knowing that President Macron has succeeded in his re-election bid. I think some in the policymaking community might be a little more unsettled, knowing that the right has won approximately 40%, but that perhaps is a discussion on domestic French politics and less on the impact of US France relations. So how is Washington likely to view President Macron's re-election? I think through 2 lenses to discuss this. The first is through the lens of how to use France within the European Union construct. And the other is how do we look at the President Macron's election victory in the bilateral context. First, in the EU context, the election no doubt has solidified President Macron as the security leader for Europe in the European Union. It's going to allow the United States to work with and through the European Union now to really focus on key areas, in particular democracy building, which has been President Biden's top priority. If you remember during his inauguration, a democracy, sort of an alignment of like-minded democracies was a big priority. Now that I shouldn't say that we should be safe that authoritarianism is on the downhill in the European Union. It is not, but with the elections elsewhere and in France, I think we see that at least for the next 5 years, we have a strong partner who understands democratic values and is aligned on with the United States on that part. And that is an area that I know Washington will be looking forward to working with President Macron on to help amplify that within the European Union. His victory obviously allows us in the United States to sort of see the EU as yet another multilateral institution in which we could strengthen some of our foreign policy objectives. Again, I'm speaking from the US side. So obviously we have the United Nations, we have NATO, we have various multilateral fora. Now is a good opportunity for the US to really emphasize the importance of the European Union institution as a legitimate security player, especially with President Macron as essentially the security leader in it. What I mean by that is, I think in the past, the United States, Washington, has tended to view EU as just one of many multilateral organizations. I think now is a good opportunity, especially with the strategic compass, for Washington to sit down through the US-EU dialogues, which we have been doing, to really strengthen that dialogue and figure out where are the real areas of opportunity that we could help the European Union on. For instance, I think as Sylvie and Pierre had pointed out in the security realm, you know, the United States can and should share lessons learned on how we fight in sort of when we have many different countries involved in a particular operation. This is essentially what the EU interoperability construct is. Many countries trying to find how to play together, use each competitive advantage that each country might have. The United States has done that in various multilateral forums. We can share lessons learned. The United States Department of Defense can perhaps invite the European Union military commands, the European Union sovereign nations militaries to come in an EU forum to talk about lessons learned on how we do logistics and command and control when we have different technologies. I think having this discussion now will help us all in the future, especially in the EU, when EU capabilities, military capabilities need to be called upon. If we can practice in tabletop exercises, if we can practice in various coordination at all levels of our ministries of defense before an actual contingency and crisis happens, I think that would add an air of legitimacy on the EU as a security and defense institution, which is what the strategic compass is trying to make the EU become. Now, on the bilateral front, with the US and France, the US now has an opportunity to really figure out how we could use Macron sort of again for advancing American foreign policy objectives. I think we can all recognize that the strategic context in the world has changed, certainly in the past year, certainly in the past 4 years, where the United States can and should not bear most of the burden in these global challenges. So what issues can President Macron lead on, and how do the United States and other partners support him in this endeavor? I think diplomacy with Russia is one factor. I think President Macron was given sort of an unfair rap, both in Washington and in European capitals, when he sort of reached out to Putin and sort of continued these diplomatic negotiations. I think President Macron is not an idiot. He knows that it's going to be a very difficult task, but he also knows that there's got to be a strong, legitimate Western power to maintain this diplomatic tie so that messages can be passed. And I think France realizes that it can be a partner in sort of this behind the scenes diplomacy, ensuring that when the time comes, and if and when President Putin comes to desire any diplomatic negotiation, Putin doesn't have to come to the United States, which could be sort of a more risky option diplomatically for Putin. He can come through France, and France can broker on both US and other European partners' behalf with Putin. Again, as Sylvie noted in the Sahel, France is the most obvious leader in that, as the United States Department of Defense withdraws its footprint in the Sahel. Where can we, the US, help boost France's efforts to combat terrorism? Because right now, Washington views the Sahel as a European problem. I can guarantee you that it won't be a European problem if and when Al-Shabaab and other Islamic extremists, violent extremist organizations gain a more serious foothold. France is the most experienced in the area. Let's use France and learn from them. I think some opportunities. Obviously, we can't talk about opportunities without AUKUS, and I'm running out of time, so I'll just touch on AUKUS. Now's the time for the United States to really look at opportunities to incorporate France, perhaps not in the nuclear component of AUKUS, but surprising to some, AUKUS also includes other key areas that France is a leading player on, quite frankly. When you talk about cybersecurity, space, France is really building its credibility. And I can't think of a better way to incorporate France, which is probably the European country with the biggest footprint in Asia, into this multilateral framework in Asia, than to sort of use their knowledge in emerging technologies. There's a way to do it. Washington just has to sit down and also convince the UK to sit down with the French to find a role for France in this AUKUS framework. And with that, I'll end my comments there.
Well, thank you very much, Edgar. Thank you to the three of you. I'll invite all the participants to write their questions in the Q&A box, but I'll start with a couple of questions myself for each of you. Maybe first to Sylvie, to go back to the European vision of Emmanuel Macron. It is kind of traditional for re-elected president to say, I have changed, I'm able to reinvent myself. What do you think will change in the way Macron approaches the EU or the European project? We know that during the first mandate, he's very much emphasized the role of the Franco-German partnership as this kind of core engine for EU reform. He's promoted this idea of European sovereignty as one pole among different poles in a kind of global geopolitical competition. Given the current security environment in Europe, given the current political environment as well with the new German coalition, what do you think will change, if anything, in the French European policy under Macron starting now? Maybe I'll continue in my list of questions and then turn to each of you. Pierre, perhaps I would love to hear your views on the future of the French Sahel policy, because we all three of you sort of touched upon it, but if you could elaborate a bit more on what are the key issues right now for Paris, in terms of the military engagement in the region, the diplomatic engagement, what exactly should we expect from France? Edgar mentioned the fact that France had sort of a special role as well to play in leading the European effort in the region. Will France be able to continue this effort? And finally, to Edgar, the question of the Franco-German relationship is also a question about US politics. So you lay down all the issues where the Biden administration and the Macron government could work together in the months and years to come. Anything to say about a potential Republican victory in November and what it would mean for this foreign policy agenda in the US, especially, as you mentioned, the need to work more closely with the EU? But Sylvie first.
Okay, what will change, or how will Macron change? I think he's started to change already before the election, thanks to the war in Ukraine. The problem with him for a long time and the source of mistrust from his European partners was that he was doing things very much on his own, right? Taking unilateral initiatives, like that's what happened with this Russian strategic initiative in 2019. He did that, when he invited Putin to his summer residence. I understand even Angela Merkel was not informed. So that, I think there he's learned his lesson. And during the presidency, the beginning of the French presidency earlier this year, he really reached out to all his European partners. And I talked to some leaders of the Baltic republics, and they said they were totally satisfied with the level of consultation and information they had, that every time he talked to Putin, he would call them before, he would call them afterwards to inform them. So this, I think, he's understood how important it is, this constant consultation with European partners. Now, a lot of things have changed. It's not only Macron who has to change, but there are a lot of new factors. Scholz, Angela Merkel is not around anymore. And I don't think Macron and Merkel always agreed on everything, but at least they had this working relationship. And I think with Scholz, this relationship still has to be built. Scholz himself, if you follow the debate in Germany, is a kind of mystery. And his views, his views on Russia are still a little bit difficult to follow, right? And again, this new era that he's declared, this Zeitenwende, is not very clear. So I think there's a lot of talking, which, a lot of France and Macron and Scholz basically will have a lot of work to do together to clear this out and see where they are going and where they are going together. And the other thing is the other factor which has changed, I think, and which is going to weigh heavily on this new environment is the role of Central Europe within the EU. Poland is now a major player because of its involvement in the war in Ukraine. I mean, as you know, for logistics and weapons and all this. And so, you know, Romania also, Baltic republics also. So, you know, I don't know which way it's going to go. It's still something which we are looking at the moment, and it's happening right now. But I think it's changing the equation, the European, you know, the relationship between member states and between France, Germany, and Central Europe. And last thing about Russia, from what Edgar said, which I thought was very interesting about how Macron's Russian initiative was seen outside. I think Macron's views on Russia and his initiatives on Russia are better understood if other European partners see that Biden or that the US administration supports it. I've noticed that over the past few months, you know, when his calls with Putin were better accepted after, for instance, video conferences with Biden or with this the Quint or whoever, whichever format they choose. But every time he could say, I have the support of Zelensky, I have the support of Biden, it went through much better. So that's an area where they can also, there's room for improvement, I guess.
Thank you. Pierre.
Sure. So about the future of the French Sahel policy, two comments. First, France is not withdrawing from the region, as it is often said. Actually, France is trying to reposition its forces in the neighboring countries of Mali, because France was forced to leave the country at the request of Bamako. So now the most pressing priority for France is to try to readjust its military footprint across the region, and not only its military footprint, but also the presence of Europeans, which have engaged quite heavily in the region through the EU or through ad hoc formats such as the Task Force Takuba. And we heard recently that Niger would be a good candidate to welcome and host these new forces. So that's the priority number one, because, as I said, terrorist groups are still resilient. They are not only acting in Mali, but across the region, and including in southern West Africa, near the Gulf of Guinea. So clearly France considers that there is still a rationale to stay in the region and to combat terrorist organizations. The second priority is to, I would say, maintain the pressure against Mali, the Malian authorities, and the Wagner Group. We have already seen that the Wagner Group has committed exactions in the country, is also pursuing disinformation campaigns, try to accuse France of committing war crimes. Recently, we saw that the Wagner groups tried to bury a corpse in a French, former French base to accuse Paris of committing such actions. So I think that Paris, with the support of the region, to be the ECOWAS organization, and also Washington, will need to maintain diplomatic pressure against Mali, a counter disinformation campaign against the Wagner Group, which will try to build this narrative against France and more broadly international prisons.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Edgar.
Yeah, so good question on the potential for a Republican victory, both this November in 2022 in our legislature, and also in 2024 in our presidency. I think it might be worth pointing out the obvious, which is the 2017, the Republican Party of 2017 is not the same as it is today. What I mean by that is that on most foreign policy issues, that affect the US-French relationship on Iran, on China, there's actually much alignment between the Democrats and Republicans. So in terms of what changes there will be on major foreign policy issues such as those, I'm not sure you'll find much change. You'll find, if anything, more skepticism of European positions and sort of a more hardline desire by both the Democrats and Republicans in Congress for France to, quote unquote, do more, especially if it's the European security leader. Just a couple of issues on China. I think you're going to find a sense of both Republicans and Democrats in November to urge France to do more, to lead on China, and in particular what France can do. And I think what Congress will be looking for from President Macron is to have a greater say to help the United States shape the desire by China to sort of influence international norms, whether it's on internet protocol, whether it's on digital economy, sort of help the US and other European partners in the UN forum counter Chinese efforts to encroach in those areas. One other thing, obviously, there's going to be a lot of talk about skepticism on any European policy, including in France, that may impinge on US businesses. Which is a key, a key priority for U.S. legislatures to protect businesses at all costs from more regulation. So on anything involving digital taxation, IP, privacy issues, I think these are going to be probably not the loudest on the front page of every newspaper, but it's going to be at the core of some of the bilateral friction that the U.S. and France is going to have if and when the Republicans win in November.
Thank you very much, Edgar. Let me take a couple of questions from the Q&A. I'll try to sort of bund them together to both Sylvie and Pierre, depending who wants to take the different questions. One is on Ukraine and the French sort of strategic goals in this conflict, whether there is a sense that Paris already has a clear vision for the status of Ukraine in this European security architecture that Macron has talked about quite at length before. Whether there's something to be said as to the length of the war itself. Now it seems that there is a consensus that this war will last for months, if not years, if this is indeed the kind of official position of the French government today. And as we mentioned, the role that France could play as a broker of a deal, what would be a good deal according to Paris today? Second question, actually two questions on the Franco-German relationship, mentioning two aspects of policy that have been sort of divisive issues for Paris and Berlin. One on the EU taxonomy, so energy policy with the inclusion of nuclear energy in the taxonomy, whether there's a chance for more convergence now with the Scholz coalition. Second, on the sanctions against Russian oil and gas. I think it was already mentioned that the President Macron has officially supported the idea of sanctions. Do you think that there is now a time for a more direct and perhaps a more robust messaging from Paris to Berlin on this issue, considering that Berlin may be the main obstacle to the imposition of sanctions? And the last question, well, maybe we'll start with this and then I'll go to the very final question. But Sylvie, Pierre, I don't know who wants to start.
I can start if you want quickly on the goals, in the French goals. I think it's interesting because we're all wondering what is the final objective, what is the end game. And obviously Secretary Austin's statement about having to weaken the Russian military, I haven't heard this in Paris, for instance. What I hear in Paris is we want to stop the war, we want a ceasefire. This is the priority. So at this stage, the vision of the status of Ukraine, future status of Ukraine, also what I hear is this is for the Ukrainians to decide. This is for Zelensky to decide, and we cannot push him one way or the other. And his views evolve with, with the events. So, but as I mentioned, those security guarantees at the moment, they are in Paris, they are working on this scenario that, because this is one of the issues which are being negotiated between Russians and Ukrainians, because, those negotiations apparently are going on at mid-level, and neutrality and security guarantees are one of the topics. And so, probably the US also would be a guarantor, maybe Germany, maybe Turkey. We don't know. This is maybe the P5. I mean, this is really a discussion which is going on. I'm not sure that France sees itself as a broker at the moment, as a possible broker. I'm not sure this has been the case at some stage, but I think Putin is now seen as so difficult to deal with, and the diplomatic solution, which could be discussed at some stage, is obviously off the cards at the moment. In the from whatever information we get out of the Kremlin. So I wouldn't be able to answer to this question on what can be considered a good deal. Or on energy and Germany, it's very difficult at the moment. I think it's difficult to say what's going to happen, on what they are going to be able to agree. I just want to finish by drawing attention to Mario Draghi's position on this, and his interview a week or 10 days ago to Corriere della Sera, where he expressed, I think, very interesting views, both on weapons deliveries to Ukraine and on gas embargo, and and possible solutions for this. So I think he should be drawn into the Franco-German or European discussion, and in a more constructive way. Maybe that would help.
Well, on my end, I think as Sylvie said, the goal for Paris, for Ukraine, is clearly to put an end to the war as soon as possible. This means first keep the pressure against Moscow, and a term often used in Paris is to asphyxiate the Russian economy. So clearly, I think Paris will push for additional sanctions against Russia, notably on the energy sector. And then keep supporting and assisting Ukrainian armed forces. And it's striking to see how France has shifted its position from the delivery of anti-tank, for instance, weapons to Ukraine, to highly advanced and heavy weaponry to Ukraine through long-range artillery. So clearly France is stepping up in terms of assistance. I think that Paris is also bracing for a long war and has highlighted in many occasions the long-term impacts of that conflict for Europe and at the global stage when it comes to, for instance, the food crisis that will be the direct consequence of that war. France has launched an initiative with the African Union to support the neighboring countries in the Middle East and Africa, which imports in a vast majority Russian or Ukrainian wheat. France is also trying to mobilize every diplomatic leverage to hold Russia accountable for its war crimes. That's clearly another priority of France. It has sent already teams to investigate in Bucha, and that won't be done overnight. This is a long-term endeavor, and it illustrates that for France, this is a tectonic shift, and we have to prepare for the ripple effects of this conflict.
Thank you, Pierre. Let me take a last round of questions, one for each of you. First to Sylvie, a question about the support of the French population for Macron's project and foreign policy vision in particular. We saw, especially in the first round, that candidates who advocated for a withdrawal of NATO or NATO integrated military command, candidates who were very critical of EU integration got more than 50% of the votes in the first round. And indeed, there is a question as to the democratic support for Macron's ambition at the international stage. Another issue is that if we look at the Paris Climate Agreement, well, the candidates who again got most of the votes in the first round do not have a climate policy that would meet the commitments of the 2015 climate agreement. So maybe if we could discuss the legitimacy, the democratic legitimacy of this foreign policy and this mandate. A question for Pierre on France's participation in European nuclear deterrence. If there is any evolution to be expected with regards to nuclear sharing with France and other European partners, as you mentioned the fact that we're entering a new era, perhaps for European security, with a new NATO strategic concept, completely new challenges to face. What about nuclear policy in France? And finally, to come back to a point that you made, Edgar, and I think it would be great to elaborate a bit. You mentioned the fact that it would be a good time for the Biden administration to think about including France to some aspects of the AUKUS deal. But if you could elaborate a bit more on the French role in general in the Indo-Pacific as it is perceived by Washington, D.C., and whether there is any expectation of a more ambitious engagement of France in the region. Maybe let's start with Sylvie.
Okay, very quickly for the sake of time. I think French voters who voted for the two major protest candidates, Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, on the left and on the far right at the first round, didn't have NATO integrated military command much in their mind. You know, I don't think it was a top issue for them. The top issue was the cost of living. And I think that's where Marine Le Pen campaigned very effectively. And her views on Europe, you know, had to be softened, and really she became almost a moderator on Europe. Of course, she says she wants the Europe of nations and so, but it was very abstract. She had to go from somebody who advocated Frexit some years ago to somebody who was in favor of pulling out of the Eurozone 5 years ago, and now she accepts all this because she realized that this was this was not going well at all with the voters. So I don't think these issues of foreign policy were major factors, and actually the leftist candidate Mélenchon, in terms of fight against climate change, was very much in favor of that. So of course the trick now, and Macron knows it too well because of the crisis of the yellow vest 3 years ago, the trick is to find how to conciliate, to coordinate the fight against carbon emission reduction with social acceptance. But I don't think French people are climato-sceptic as such. So this is a challenge, but I don't think there's opposition of French public opinion on foreign policy, basically. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
On nuclear deterrence, President Macron already made quite an important speech at the École de Guerre in 2020, in which he explained the European dimension of French nuclear deterrence, underlining that France's national interests were intertwined with European interests. I don't know the exact wording, but he already displayed that the French nuclear deterrence had a European dimension. What is striking me is that France has repeatedly stressed that the current crisis with Russia has a nuclear dimension. And it is reported that France has leveled up its nuclear posture by deploying additional nuclear submarines, by conducting a test of a nuclear missile, just to signal to Moscow that on the NATO side, there was also a nuclear posture and an ambition and a capability to answer on the nuclear domain. Beyond that, I think France is also concerned about the complete legal void in terms of arms control and the fact that we do not have any more legal international treaties to regulate the use of force, the deployment of nuclear capabilities. And I expect France to push on an agenda in terms of arms control after the war, because clearly this is a destabilizing factor in the continent.
Excellent. Edgar, for your concluding words.
Yeah, so just quickly, I think, I've always said this, and Pierre is the expert in this. Look, France is the European power that has done the most in the Indo-Pacific, that is more aligned with the US on military and security issues. Of course, France has the largest amount of its economic exclusion zone in the Indo-Pacific, as well as its population. It's done more freedom of navigation operations through the Taiwan Strait Transit than either the UK or Germany. It has increased the capabilities that it has, France has increased the military capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, and they've done more with them. For instance, the signals intelligence ship in last September that transited the Taiwan Strait, it's done a lot already. And quite frankly, I think the US has quietly recognized that. I think where we can employ France and some of its other sort of less hardline military capabilities in emerging technology and defense industries is actually in the non-military arena. Perhaps incorporate France more into leading US and European efforts for tsunami alert in the South Pacific. It's something that would help the region and provide France's soft power in the region. Additionally, ecological surveys. I think the French have the capacity to conduct more of these ecological surveys in coordination with the US and other partners, including in Southeast Asia, which, as Pierre has written about, France is trying to improve its relationships with. So there are a number of areas outside of the hardline military capabilities that I think France's defense and foreign ministry can look to take leading roles in.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Edgar. Thank you to the three of you, and thank you all for following us during this virtual event. It was really, really interesting and topical to have this discussion. I should just add that if you are interested in following the state and evolution of the French-US relations, there's a new online platform that was launched a couple of weeks ago by the Bertelsmann Foundation. The platform is called the Transatlantic Periscope, and it brings together news and analysis on the state of various bilateral relationships, and the French-US relation is covered by the GMF Paris office. So you should definitely have a look. This is really a great tool. Thank you again to all of you, and we'll continue to work on these issues at GMF Paris in the weeks and months to come. Hope to see you soon in a next event or meeting that we will organize. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.